So Army of Anyone. So this self-titled album comes out in 2006. We already mentioned that's the super group with members of Corn, Filter, and Stone Temple Pilots. So this album, you mentioned to me before, you consider
Yeah,
this one of the greatest albums of all time that nobody's heard. So it did have two singles, but they kind of came out and disappeared. They thought this album, because each of the individual bands have gone
yeah,
multi-platinum, they thought for sure this would be a big multi-platinum hit, and it sells about 88,000 copies, which to a major label is
yeah. That's
nothing. And
nothing.
why, like, why do you think, why, because it's a great album, why do you think it just kind of was went under the radar?
um, I really don't know because I mean they made the rounds. They played Leno. I think they did Letterman. They did some touring right off the hop. And they did like clubs like House of Blues. There's some footage on the internet of them doing a show at the Masquerade in Atlanta, which is like 1,000-seat venue. They came up to Toronto and did I think 2 nights at the Horseshoe. I know at the time some of the Richard Patrick was struggling with his voice because they ended up, I think, bailing on one of the Toronto shows. I just think there's a point in that part of early 2000s sort of modern rock or active rock where records are got lost in the shuffle. We always kind of thought that like the Idle Sons record kind of got lost in the shuffle around that same time when it came out in 06. And this record felt the same to me. It felt kind of like a kindred spirit. Like it's just this really fantastic record. It sounds amazing. It sounds so good, and then you look, it's like, oh, it's Bob Ezrin produced it, and the songs are great, but I think maybe like they're not edgy enough for some people at that time, where in '04, like you've had a few years of these bands, and then people are looking to sort of push the envelope further in one direction or the other. And it's also an incredibly artistic sounding record, like the lead off single was the song Goodbye. It's like the only song I've ever heard on the radio that has a drum solo in the middle of it and a drum solo in the outro that goes on the album for like 4 minutes. But it's just such a cool sounding band. And I think also maybe people were a little reluctant to hear a band that sounded like the Stone Temple Pilots that wasn't
Scott.
Scott. Because before this, there's another band that the brothers did called Talk Show that's really cool too. It's more Beatley, less hard rocky, but there's a single you can look up that's called Hello Hello by the band Talk Show, and it's the DeLeo brothers and Eric, the drummer from Stone Temple Pilots, with a different singer. And it's the same thing. It's this incredible sounding record that like nobody bought. And the Army of Anyone record, I feel, is like it's the same thing, but for me and like for my friends that were really into it when it came out, it was like this secret that we had that like nobody knows about. And to talk maybe about the how who this record ended up reaching, literally 3 days ago I was in catering on tour on the Disturbed tour, and the drummer of Disturbed was talking to Joe, the drummer from Theory of a Dead Man, about like favorite records, and he brought up this album, and I actually stopped the mid conversation. I was like, "Wait, you like Army of Anyone? I'm Bruce, by the way. That's awesome! Like nobody knows about this record." And he was the same way. He was like, "I know no one has ever heard this album, and it's so cool." And like the songs, like you go the first 3-4 songs, just like seamlessly kind of all fade into each other, and it's like just this one great experience. And obviously, as a bass player or a retired bass player, like Robert DeLeo's playing on it is like unbelievable, and obviously Ray, and I feel like probably Dean and Richard probably don't get enough kudos for what they do on the album. I mean, I really think it's probably Richard Patrick's most interesting vocal performance compared to, especially because like the third Filter album, The Amalgamate, came out like just before this, which is 45 minutes of Richard Patrick yelling at you, which is awesome, by the way. I don't want you can't swear in this show, right? Or you shouldn't swear.
You can say whatever you
Okay,
want.
that record is fucking dope. It's like Tom Lord Alge mixed it. It's like it's super duper compressed, but it's like just guitars on top of guitars on top of guitars on, like there's so much guitar in there, and the drumming is fantastic. And so for him to go from that record, which is very, very aggressive and very, I wouldn't say linear, but definitely focused, into this Army of Anyone record where I didn't know he could sing like that, which I think is awesome. It's just, yeah, it's another record that I probably, if you gave me the time, I would not stop gushing about.
So 04 to 06, I think that's like the peak of like the illegal downloading and the Napster,
Yeah,
and like iTunes finally comes out. And do you think that maybe that had to do with it? Is it was at the peak where maybe people were getting excited about, hey, I can actually access this for free, and that affected the sales on your album Idle Sons around that time and this album?
I think for a band like Army of Anyone, because it didn't really feel like it got like a huge push in popular media, like you didn't hear a ton of it on the radio. You didn't hear like people. It wasn't a record people were like really talking about as much as I thought they would be. Definitely, I bet you there's probably 1 million copies of it on people's old hard drives in the computers in their basement. But it definitely felt like it just didn't get that push, like that's also around the time where like sync licensing and like video games and stuff is really, really starting to get really important. I don't think it's on any video games, because I remember like the first place I heard Seven Dust was like ATV Off-Road Fury on PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2, and I don't think it got synced to anything, but man, the first song on that record, like it's just such a great opener, lyrically, and the bass playing, like, and the drumming, everything. It's just such a killer song, and it wasn't a single, which
Yeah,
is
I mean,
crazy to me.
If you're thinking of super groups around the same time, you have Audio Slave, and
Yeah,
they go on to sell millions and millions and millions and have all these hit singles and all these albums, and you're like, well, both of these groups are great, and both of the music for both of them are great. Like, why did this one blow up and this one, this was Army of Anyone's only album, and it has to be
yeah,
because of the disappointing album sales that they're like, well, we can't green light anything after this.
yeah. I imagine there was probably a lot of consternation with some guy in an office on a telephone. Um, I don't know, because there's so little information out there about the album cycle and what went on. There's not a ton of stuff on like YouTube. If you're looking for live performances, there's not very much out there, and I definitely would not have worked up the courage to ask, in my one opportunity to meet the brothers. I probably definitely wouldn't have asked, even though I like that record probably almost as much, or if not more, than I like the first STP album, which, if you were, if the list was expanded to the top 10, Core would be in there for all the same reasons why I love the Army of Anyone record. But yeah, I don't know. I don't, maybe, I don't want to speculate, but I don't think it's fair.
Yeah, life isn't fair, is it? Especially not in the music industry. But if you were like a betting man and you looked at this and you're like, okay, there's members from multi-platinum Stone Temple Pilots, multi-platinum band Filter, multi-platinum band Korn, then it's produced by Bob Ezrin, who did Pink Floyd's The Wall. He's done Alice Cooper. He's done who else do we have here? We have
Dark Side of the Moon. Did Bob do Dark Side of the Moon? No, I don't think
he did one of those two big ones. It was either
Yeah,
The Wall or I think it was The Wall, and then
but
he
he
did
also
Division
did
Bell and a third Pink Floyd album. But he's done
in more
Kiss.
modern times, he did Deftones. He did 2 Deftones records, I think.
Yeah, so it's like you have these amazing popular musicians that know how to make hits. They've already proven, and great music and great albums. And then they're under the supervision of one of the greatest producers of all time. It's like if you were a betting man, you would bet that this would be a successful album.
Yeah, without even hearing it. And then you hear the record, and it's like sonically, it's fantastic sounding. You know, if you were to, you know, give me a blank slate and like $2 million and said, what does your perfect rock record sound like? Perfect modern rock record for that era. That's the one. Like, the drums sound fantastic, but they don't sound, they don't sound pedestrian or like every other drum set of the time. Obviously, Dean and Robert DeLeo, the guitar tones are unique and interesting. It just doesn't just sound like a Marshall with a 57 on it. It's like really, not that there's anything wrong with that. It's really unique sounding. The vocal deliveries are really cool. They're great performances. The bass playing is a masterclass in modern rock bass playing. Right off the hop. Again, first song, listen to the bass part. It's so good. And it's like, it's one of those things where I definitely had a phase in my career as a bass player where I spent a lot of time wishing I could write lines like that and make them sound effortless, And Rick Beato on his YouTube channel
He's
has
awesome.
like an hour and a half interview with Robert DeLeo, mostly about STP. I don't even think they bring up Army of Anyone at all, which leads me to believe that it might be a bit of a sore spot. The way he describes how he wrote these songs, you're just like, wow, it's just that easy for you, eh? Like, I couldn't imagine,
He was showing that, they start as like a flamenco song, and it was very cool. Yeah. It was just like a bossa nova thing. And
yeah, I would love if the opportunity ever presented itself and I could do it without being a complete puddle. I would love to sit down with that guy and have a chat about that record specifically, because no one really knows about it, and no one knows what happened to it and why it went the way it went. I'm crossing my fingers, and hoping amongst hope that, it's some sort of Greek tragedy involving politics and record labels, and not that like the band couldn't get along or something, and that they were, architects of their own demise. That would really suck.
Maybe I'll make that my biggest goal for the podcast is someday have one of those four members on and ask questions about Army of Anyone throughout there. Have you heard about the backstory of how these members got together and ended up?
I have no idea. I just know one of our A&R reps at EMI gave it to us and was like, hey, this is a tour you might be able to get on. You should listen to the music and see if you like it. And like, just being like, Michelle, this is unbelievable. Where did this come from? She's like, oh, it's this band. They're doing this snowcore tour and they're looking for support acts. And we think like maybe this could be good for you guys. And we didn't get it. I don't remember who did get the tour. I don't even think the tour ended up finishing. I think they ended up folding that tour up before it was done. But yeah, man, like that record is something else.
Yeah, so it was the singer from Filter who was in rehab, and then you had Stone Temple Pilots had recently broken up because of Scott's drug problem. So you had both bands kind of in limbo with not much going on. And once the singer from Filter started to get a little bit better, writing sessions started to happen for the fourth album, the album after the one you talked about that was,
the Amalgamate.
Really heavy. So the fourth album. So the singer from Filter heard that the brothers in Stone Temple Pilots were interested in writing at least one song on the Filter album. So when they got together, it ended up being like a 12-hour jam session. And the singer from Filter was so impressed with what they had done that he actually pushed back the fourth Filter album, and the label wasn't happy about it because that's a for sure like million seller. He pushed that back to start this group, and that's how it started. It was a writing session for Filter. So
that's great. Those are the kind of stories you like to hear about records you like, is that, like this kind of came together kind of organically, and we did a couple of writing sessions and it really looked like it was working out. And so that really makes me happy. And again, like that's such a fun, interesting record. And again, I think it might be up there as far as like what you would want a modern rock record at that point in time to sound like.
Yeah,
I think it has great songs.
Yeah, you've mentioned like the bass stands out and other things stand out. To me, the drums
Yeah,
were just like, again, right off the bat, the first song, I think you said there's a drum solo in there.
yeah.
And
It
I
starts
was
with
like,
a
this
drum
is,
fill.
yeah, this is incredible. So all the way through the drums, and there's great drummers on lots of albums, but this
Yeah,
one specifically, it's like there's something so tasty about the drum playing on this one. It was next level, even amongst next level drumming on albums.
yeah, and like Ray Luzier hadn't joined Korn yet by the time that record was made. I think he was just a session guy at the time.
I think he was with David Lee Roth on some tours.
That only makes it better, right? Like,
Yeah.
but yeah, and again, like the drum sound itself is really unique. The way the tonality of the drums and where it sits in the mix, it definitely feels more like a driving force and less than a supporting role. It's one of those records, and it's a record that's got really great guitar playing on it, but I don't see it as a guitar driven record. It really feels like it's more driven by the rhythm section. And there's some great guitar sounds, and Dean has some really great slide work in there that's again kind of out of place for '04 in modern rock. Not a ton of guys playing slide. There's some really great slide work in there. And it's this record that, like, yeah, it just I have a hard time sometimes putting my finger on why it sounds so great, because there's so many great aspects to it.
So two final things, and we'll move on to your
Yeah,
last album from Marvin Gaye. Just like the Public Enemy album mentioned that they were trying to do the hip hop equivalent of the Marvin Gaye album, tying two of your five
yeah.
albums together. We found a common link here in this album.
Which I
So
had no idea about.
right, so this is very cool. So this album from Army of Anyone it had its original mix, and at the last minute they did a different mix, and the person that mixed it was the singer from Failure, which ties together a different album in your top five. So
Yeah,
Ken Andrews from Failure. So the only reason they had enough time to do this last minute mix is he had his own home studio with Pro Tools. So he just got to work, did the mix,
yeah.
presented it, and ended up being the final mix the way that and loved the album and loved the sound.
Which does kind of make sense to me now, because I believe he also mixed the first Tenacious D album, which is also just a fantastic sounding record. If you listen to like Tribute off that album, it's just this incredible sounding rock song. So that does kind of make sense to me. It's funny, I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't know that, because like I'm a pretty big nerd, especially when it comes to like production and credits and who worked on what. And not once in all the years that I've listened to that record, and I've been listening to it pretty constantly since 2004, did I ever look up who produced it and who mixed it or who engineered it or where it was recorded. I assume it was recorded in Georgia, where the STP records were made, but I don't really know.
So this is, if you have one takeaway from this interview, it's that Ken Andrews ended up mixing it. So I have one positive review for the album, and then we'll move on. So all music,
there are none.
There's just one person that liked it. So all music described the album as boasting sharply written numbers filled with dynamics, musical nuances, and a big sound courtesy of producer Bob Ezrin. With its mixture of moods, subtle use of genre shifting, and powerhouse guitars, Army of Anyone breaks down rock barriers. So a nice review that we wish led
Anybody
to
paid attention to.
led to some more album sales than it got.